So the topic for this week is the mechanical worldview, but I think that undersells the topic a little bit. This week we're going to talk about God or gods, what the universe is made of, and how that affects our understanding of the causal structure of reality. So I didn't know how to put that in a short version, so I called it the mechanical worldview, but that's what we'll be talking about. So this is the last week we're going to read any of the Bala book, so enjoy it while it lasts. In both videos this week, I'll be talking about the main ideas in the chapter. So both videos are essentially lecture or readings overview. In keeping with his overall thesis in the book, which you should be sort of familiar with the pattern of by now, in this chapter, Bala argues that the traditional story for the history of the concept of atomism leaves out some important bits. That is, it goes from the traditional story of atomism starts with the ancient Greeks, and then pretty much goes directly to the Renaissance or the scientific revolution in Europe. And you'll be unsurprised to hear by this point in the course that Bala thinks that leaves out some pretty important sources from India and the Islamic world. So in this video, I'm just going to tell you about the ancient Greek sources for atomism. And in the next video, we'll start in on talking about the Islamic world. I'm not going to have time to get into the Indian sources, but you can see that in the readings. Okay. And then finally, on the next video, we'll talk a little bit about the scientific revolution version of this. Okay. So, coming up with the theory of matter as composed by atoms is undoubtedly one of the just enormous scientific achievements in the history of the modern era. This week, we'll sort of trace out some of the history of this. I want to warn you that this picture here of an atom is not what most of the people involved in this conversation have in mind. So this is I believe this is a 20th century innovation. I don't remember when the Bohr model of the atom gets developed, but they're not talking about atoms in the sense of things composed by nuclei with electrons going around them. They have a much simpler version of the atom, and everybody in this conversation believes that atoms are indivisible. So they're supposed to be the basic units of matter. Okay, so before we get to the ancient Greek sources of atomism, I need to explain a little bit about this guy, Parmenides. Okay, so Parmenides is a pre-Socratic, so he's very old in the kind of history of Greek philosophy. We've only got one work that's left by him, although he's talked about by a bunch of ancient sources. We've got parts of a poem that he wrote called On Nature. So ancient Greek philosophy was never lacking in style, let's say that. So this poem starts with a first-person account of Parmenides being taken on a ride by a heavenly chariot along the way of the goddess, guided by maidens on the way to the gates of night and day, which he then passes through and talks to the goddess. The goddess starts by congratulating him on being such a swell fella, and then begins to disclose unto him the nature of reality. Okay, so, really solid intro to his philosophy. And the poem, so here's a little bit of it, just to explain his most central idea. So, okay, to read this out. Come now, I will tell thee, this is the goddess speaking. Come now, I will tell thee, and do thou hearken to my saying and carry it away. The only two ways of search that can be thought of. The first, namely, that it is, and that it is impossible for anything not to be, is the way of conviction, for truth is its companion. The other, namely, that it is not, and that something must not be, that, I tell thee, is wholly untrustworthy path. For you cannot know what is not, that is impossible, nor utter it. Okay, so what was all that about? So in this passage, Parmenides is understood to be saying that there are two ways of knowing the way of it is, that is asserting things are, and another way of knowing saying it is not, asserting that something is not. And he thinks, he draws from the message of the goddess that it is the only way to go. It is not is a kind of delusory mistake, which means that you can't refer to something not existing. So you can't say there's no elephant in this room, because that's asserting something about something that isn't there. And the meaning of our words depends on their reference, depends on the thing being there to refer to. So if you try to refer to something not being, your sentence is misunderstood. Like your sentence is sort of unintelligible. Okay. So that's probably a bit obscure, but just go with it. Keep following along here. So you can't talk about non-being because non-being isn't a thing, because you can only talk about things that are. So if your ideas and sentences get their meaning from the things that they pick out in the world, then you can only talk about things that are. And this has some pretty radical consequences. For example, you can't talk about change on Parmenides' view. So he believes that all of the change that is apparently around you, you think that things have been happening, things have been changing. Parmenides thinks that's got to be wrong, because change is something going from being to non-being, or from non-being to being. But non-being, the way of it is not, is literally nonsense. So there's no such thing as change or time or differences between things. So everything is just one. And also the universe is a sphere for reasons that are obscure even to me. Parmenides gives us this sort of a poem, sort of an argument that change isn't real. This is actually taken very seriously by other Greek philosophers. Not that many people agree with him, but they take it very seriously. So one of the people that follow along in the Parmenidean tradition is Zeno. So if you've heard of Zeno's paradoxes of motion, those are meant to establish the basic idea that Parmenides is defending here, which is that change is an illusion. Your senses are fooling you when you think anything is changing, when you think time is passing, when you think there's a difference between any object and any other object. Okay, this is important. So, let's keep going. So, Leucippus and his student Democritus, who are mentioned in the readings, are two figures that are kind of credited with coming up with the ancient Greek version of atomism. Okay, so, and atomism is one way to respond to Parmenides. So atomism is a theory about how matter works that's supposed to get around this idea that nothing can ever come into being or go out of being. So how do they respond? So the atomist idea is that the universe is made up of a bunch of tiny, like invisibly tiny, indivisible, so you can't cut them or change them, unchanging objects, which they call atoms. And between the atoms is void, is absolute emptiness. So change, according to the story, is rearranging the atoms. And this is a response to Parmenides, because what they're doing is coming up with a way of describing change without anything coming into being or going out of being. So all of the atoms are timeless and eternal. They just move around. So there. Take that, Parmenides. We've got a way of getting around the idea that things can't come into being or go out of being, but nonetheless to preserve the idea of change. Okay, so this is a somewhat uncharitable representation of how Democritus thought of the atoms. There you can see is the atom. It's uncharitable because he thought that atoms come in all kinds of different shapes. I mean, sure, there are circular or spherical atoms for Democritus, but he thought that there were some pointy ones and some jagged ones, and that you could detect the difference between the shapes of the atoms in senses like taste, for example. So he thought that a bitter taste was a result of jagged little atoms kind of scratching up your tongue on the micro level, and sweetness is a result of smooth atoms, which sort of flow nicely across your tongue without hurting it. So these atoms had shape. They weren't just points, but they could never be cut. So there's nothing in the universe that could like split one of these atoms in two. Okay, so ancient Greek atomism. Now, the atomists were also what you might call mechanists. So they thought that the ultimate explanation for every kind of physical thing in the universe is going to boil down to atoms bumping into each other. Or they were also, Democritus in particular was also an indeterminist, which means that he thinks that it's not just the atoms sometimes swerve randomly. So they do some random stuff. That's part of the explanation for anything that happens. But also they mostly are just bumping into each other. Now, recall the Aristotelian worldview, where there's lots of different ways of explaining something. And we talked specifically about teleological explanations, that is, goal-based explanations, when you explain something in terms of the goal that it's trying to reach. And remember that Aristotle was really a big fan of this and included teleological explanations in his physics. So Democritus is doing this kind of very modern-seeming thing where he says, look, it's just a bunch of atoms bouncing off each other. There's no real goals in the world. There's no real teleology. All there is a bunch of atoms at the end. And if you want to understand or explain anything, you have to understand or explain it ultimately in terms of just physical things bumping into each other. Okay, so that's the connection between atomism and mechanism in the ancient Greek model. Aristotle's understanding of matter was not atomistic. He thought that matter is infinitely divisible. So for any chunk of matter, you could slice it up into two chunks, right? So not necessarily in practice, like you've only got a knife that's so sharp, so eventually you're just going to squish it rather than cut it. But in principle, at least, there's no limit to how finely you could split up bits of matter. He's got several arguments for this. I'm sorry, I'm presenting these positions without really presenting the in-depth arguments for them, but that's a whole course that you'd have to take. So yeah, there are arguments for these positions, but really we've only got time to hit the kind of highlights, which are the conclusions. Okay, and again, in contrast to the mechanists, recall Aristotle's thing about causation. Things do what they do, at least partly, in order to get to their goals. So fire goes up because it's trying to get back to its proper place in the universe, which is up above the air. And part of this story that I didn't really elaborate on last time I went through this was that Aristotle thinks that this is part of the essence of fire. So the essence of something is what it is in and of itself. Now, if I have a fire in a park near my house, or if I have a fire on a beach far away, those are two different positions for the fire, but the position isn't really part of the essence, right? It's not what it is to be a fire. Whereas being hot, emitting light, going up, Aristotle thinks those are part of the essence of what makes something fire. These are the kind of unchanging properties. If anything's fire, then it's hot and it's trying to get up above the air. So these goal-based explanations are connected to essences of things. Okay, so for Aristotle, some causes that come from the essences of things are necessary. So what that means for something to be necessary in this context is to say that it just couldn't have been any other way. So if something's necessary, then it's impossible for it to have been otherwise. So when a rock sinks in water, that interaction, because it's a product of the essences of the rock, which is made of earth, and the water, which is water, the essences of those things determine necessarily how they're going to behave with respect to each other, which means the causal connection between those two things. So the fact that the rock is sinking into the water is actually, in some deep sense, logically necessary. So it just could not have gone any other way. This raises a question which will be relevant, especially in the next lecture. How does Aristotle think we know about these essences? So what's his epistemology? What's his theory of knowledge? And Aristotle is what you might call, charitably, a direct realist. Uncharitably, this is sometimes called a naive realist. So suppose that I want to know about the essence of apples. I look at a bunch of apples. I can be fooled. I can be mistaken about what their essence is. But really, I just sort of, if I'm careful, if I'm sober, if I'm paying good attention, and there's nothing kind of directly interfering with my observation, I get, in some sense, the form of the apple in my mind. So what it means to be an apple can be, I can be informed by the apple, or I can be informed by the fire. That is, I can take on the kind of structural, functional relationships that make something what it is and have them kind of directly in my mind. Okay, so this means, so if you add this up, his epistemology of direct realism, where you just see what's in the world, and you see it in the sense of the form of the thing gets taken into your mind, and your mind now contains the form of the thing. That kind of direct connectedness to the world, combined with his theory about the essences of things and how those essences play into causal relations, means that you can know in a very direct way, for Aristotle, how things are causally interacting with each other. So if you understand what Earth is and you understand what water is by having directly observed them and being informed by their essences, that is, you have some version of their form in your head, then you know the necessary connections between things. So it's a very sort of, I wish the world was like this. So notice the difference between this and the way that people usually think about perception of the world today. So usually we don't think of things in terms of direct realism. We think, I have some representation of the world in my mind. I have some picture of it, and that picture can be distorted and mistaken. I don't really have access to the world directly. I have evidence about the world. I have ways of knowing that make my guesses better than chance. But for Aristotle, you really get part of the world in your mind. So it's a very direct, very solid connection with reality itself. Okay, so this way of thinking about how we understand the world turns out to be not super great for science, I would argue. This is me being a bit speculative, so don't take this to the bank. This is sort of my take on the relationship between the epistemology and metaphysics in Aristotle and how science sort of developed over the centuries. So grain of salt time, but I would say that people made a lot more progress in their scientific projects when they didn't assume that they had direct access to the essence of things through their senses. So when you start questioning whether you really know what you're looking at, so you have an impression, you have an intuitive impression of what the thing is that you're looking at, and you can either sort of be convinced that you really get the deep structure of it, or you can be convinced that you maybe don't really know what's going on. So I would argue that the people who are less sure that they know about the structure of reality just by looking at it are more likely to get deeper into that structure. So they're going to ask different questions. They're going to ask broader questions. They're not going to take their perceptions to be necessarily reliable guides to how reality is structured. And I think that it's fairly clear from looking at the history that people who are willing to question this direct realism account of how knowledge works made a lot more progress. So in modern science, we assume that you have to sort of dig and search and, don't assume anything and assume that you could be wrong, assume that you could be deceived, and find the kind of hidden or mysterious causes behind things. And when people made that assumption, they seem to have done a lot better at coming up with the deep structure of reality than people who think that you can just sort of read it off of the surface of things in a very direct and intuitive way. Okay, so how did we get to this modern picture of indirect realism, or something even stranger than that? So that's going to be the story in the next video. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about basically how the Aristotelian worldview starts to get overturned. And it's going to have to do with this guy in the picture here, Al-Ghazali, and a critique that he makes for religious reasons of Aristotle's picture of epistemology and causation. Okay, so let's take that up in the next video. Thanks.